Oh, your baby is so pretty. What a perfect little blonde-haired, blue-eyed angel. Oh my God, honey, your daughter's getting married? To a doctor? Well, at least my new girlfriend comes from a good family. Why does my kid always hang out with the trashy kids? We aren't trashy. We've all heard those statements a few times in our lives or something close. We may have even said them. Maybe we just heard them on TV or in a movie. Regardless, they're all problematic and speak to an atrocity most of us would shudder to associate ourselves with. In the mid-19th through the early 20th centuries, a movement started that suggested humanity might be a little flawed. Like this perfect God some people believe in made some pretty basic mistakes. Like when you're baking lots of things at the same time and you accidentally use baking soda instead of baking powder. Whoops, too much butter, one too many eggs. Salt instead of sugar, you have been chopped. This movement suggested that not only was humanity flawed, but we, humans, could play God to right the wrongs of whatever deity did this. Well, more like this movement suggested that not all humanity was flawed, just some humanity was flawed. That movement, quite controversial, was the eugenics movement. Eugenics, most broadly associated with a certain mustachioed madman, is exemplified by the statements I just made a moment ago. We want perfect children to get together with other perfect children to make more perfect grandchildren and carry on our perfect genetic lineage and legacies. What I'm arguing in Eugene Ick is that the eugenics movement of the early 20th century has never quite gone away. In fact, the more openly demonized it became after Adolf Hitler embraced it, the more it seemed to passively trickle its way into our pop culture, our zeitgeist, our societal norms, and mores. We've let some harmless phrases and borderline problematic ideas shift and shape our society's norms. So which came first? Did society feel this way? That's probably so, given America's shameful treatment of others and our own. Did society buy into all these ideals played off as jokes or whispers between friends? Absolutely. That's just marketing. There's a reason videos go viral and commercials sell consumers capitalism. The reason is we're easily manipulated sheeple, and that's even easier when those manipulating us can relate to us. Most of us are so knee-deep in our occultisms, we have no idea we're surrendering the very values we espouse to possess so proudly. I've covered a lot of that in different ways this season. What I'd love to discuss now is America's quest for perfection and the idea that we can play God with deoxyribonucleic acid. From home DNA test kits that trace your genealogy to kings and stars, because who just wants to be a normie? All the way to ethnic cleansing. I'm talking about something we see all around the world and some of us condemn, but most turn a blind eye to in our own backyards. This episode is about eugenics, genetics, eugenics, euphenics, and euthenics. And it's going to cover some pretty difficult history and pose some very uncomfortable and maybe controversial moral and ethical dilemmas. I will offer that trigger warning up front because while I think it's important to know and understand history, I also realize that some topics hit too close to home for some of my audience. I hear your feedback, and I hope I can embrace that. Thank you for it. However, this is a topic oft swept under the rug, even though we are prone to these attitudes our own selves in other minor ways disguised as something called preferential breeding. You'll find out more about that phrase that makes us sound like livestock, how it's different from this movement I'm talking about, and how it relates to one of the sickest ideas a human has ever conceived. Eugene Ick! And welcome to the podcast. This may fly over some of your heads, but if you're close to my age, Then you'll remember the G.I. Joe toys, not the big 12-inch figures from the 70s, but the 3 3/4-inch figures from the 1980s. G.I. Joe had a cartoon, thanks to one of Reagan's first acts after swearing in as president in 1981, deregulation of children's programming. In fact, for a period before the 80s, once we realized the science behind brainwashing and media manipulation and how that affects young, developing brains, advertising and marketing to children during their television programming wasn't a thing the way it is today. Mr. Rogers wasn't on a Frosted Flakes commercial, and Tony the Tiger, for all his greatness, never got his own show. There weren't Sesame Street figures. The lines were clearly drawn. Until Reagan said the free market should decide success and opportunity in America. Science and common sense be damned. So the G.I. Joes from the 1970s shrunk down and they became a unit of specialized experts in all things military rather than just some guy named Joe with a fabulous closet of costumes. Facial hair Barbie became an action figure boys would play with. Kung Fu grip turned to swivel arm battle grip, and the hands of the figures crafted perfectly to fit all the little guns the kids could buy. And they got a cartoon. A very campy cartoon, if I must say. At the end of each episode, they would have a quick mini-episode PSA, a public service announcement, where out of the random blue, a grown-ass man, one of the 3 women in G.I. Joe maybe, would don their little costumes and show up to impart some wisdom, and no one asks why. Like downed power lines and kids riding their bikes around them, one of the Joes, a soldier, in gear, shows up to warn the kids about the dangers of downed power lines. The kids would say, "Now we know," and the Joe would say, "And knowing is half the battle. Yo, Joe!" There's some responsibility in children's programming. After all, nobody died in G.I. Joe much. You always see the nameless soldiers parachuting out of the exploding jet. No talk of military budgets, no talk of geopolitical ethical boundaries, stereotyping culture more than representing diversity. Strong, female, powerful representation, maybe, that always reverted to a damsel in distress situation. From Lady J to Jinx to, yes, CoverGirl, G.I. Joe was a boy's toy aimed at boys. Now you know. And knowing is half the battle. In that animated series, which was created for the sole purpose of selling toys and comic books, which were written to sell toys and promote the cartoon, again, something that just couldn't be done until Reagan, there was a mini-series called Arise, Serpentor, Arise. The leader of the cartoon's big bad terrorist group, Cobra, was Cobra Commander, who always seemed to be foiled by the world's most elite military unit, G.I. Joe. With his minions and mercenaries growing weary of the commander's constant failings, they enlisted the help of mad scientist Dr. Mindbender to Frankenstein the perfect leader, a replacement that would surely succeed where they had constantly failed before. This leader, Serpentor, would don a giant gold and green scaled cobra costume, an actual cobra headpiece. Like the dude's face was coming out of the cobra mask's open mouth. Honestly, back in the day, it was pretty badass, if I'm going to be real, right? It's the one you wanted. This is where a young Josh Brandon first learned the term deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. Actually, it was more like deoxyribonucleic acid. That cartoon, for all its silliness and suspension of disbelief, taught me about science. I learned a lot from Mr. Wizard, mind you, but deoxyribonucleic acid, I got from Dr. Mindbender. So the premise of this mini-series is that Dr. Mindbender has unlocked cloning science. To craft the perfect villainous super leader, Cobra became Tomb Raiders, scouring the globe for the burial sites of history's most ruthless rulers and strongest strategists. Attila the Hun, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Hannibal, along with the DNA of Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, Alexander the Great and his dad too, Ivan the Terrible, Genghis Khan, not the John Wayne version, mind you, Geronimo, Eric the Red, Rasputin, Montezuma, presumably for his revenge tactics, and a fictional Egyptian general they made up for the show. You've heard of the book The Art of War? It's right behind me. Written by Chinese general and legendary war strategist Sun Tzu, and occasionally narrated on social media by Elmo, The G.I. Joe cartoon had Sun Tzu's DNA as part of the original mix, but in the show, the mission to get his DNA got botched thanks to G.I. Joe, specifically their drill sergeant, Sergeant Slaughter. The wrestler? He was a special edition G.I. Joe toy back then. And yeah, he was also in the cartoon. And yeah, instead of Sun Tzu's DNA, Dr. Mindbender, the evil genius behind cloning science of creating an actual human out of an amorphous blob, said, "You know what? Forget the literal author of The Art of War. We've got wrestler Sergeant Slaughter. Just use that." Suspension of disbelief, indeed. What this was, whether we knew it or not, was an education on the future of science. DNA would guide us, either to great discoveries or treacherous terrorism, depending on who had access to the tech. Yes, it was a children's cartoon from 1986. However, it begs the question of ethics, even in a young Josh, of just because we can, should we? Especially when it comes to DNA. Dolly the sheep, the first cloned mammal, was a major story around that same time, 1986. What they did in that case was take a mammary cell, a sheep tit, and cloned an entire copy of that animal out of that one glandular cell. Groundbreaking. Named after Dolly Parton, Dolly had 6 little lambs, 6 lambs that came from a clone of another sheep. The average life expectancy for sheep is on the high end, 12 years. Dolly was put down after 6 because of arthritis and lung disease, caused by a virus and not from being a clone, the lab insisted. Dolly wasn't the only, just the first. And this episode isn't about Serpentor, the DNA fondue dreams of a warped madman, or Dolly, the fleeced fantasy of well-trained physiologists. This episode is about us, real people, not far removed from sheep. The idea of cloning and manipulating DNA has been around for some time. It's nothing new. This was 1986, folks. So I'm saying for it to be mainstream media and in entertainment programming, we've had to have gone from a science fiction conceived out of this world unrealistic idea to, wait, there's a way to actually do this discovery, to, oh, this might actually work, experimentation, all the way to, I think we're ready to tell other people outside of this laboratory. Then and only then does it get written into a children's cartoon. Look, if it wasn't for Dolly happening at the same time, maybe we would chalk this G.I. Joe plot up to a Simpsons prediction. It wasn't real, but the science was slowly developing anyway, so sometimes science fiction just eventually becomes science. But cloning was a real thing in the science community, especially as far as studying DNA. DNA used in criminal investigations, court cases, reality TV paternity exposures, medical science. Each has its own need and use for the technology, each with its own slow journey into the public eye. However, where there's light, there's also darkness. The more we use DNA science to seek justice for past cases, the more we expose our justice system for being as flawed as it was and is. The more we see DNA science used in our court system for all nature of things, the more we will inevitably see the court system as a for-profit engine of injustice. The more we allow the gladiators sport low-hanging fruit of attention span and shock entertainment, the more we make light of the real trauma involved in those familial paternity scenarios, the less we consider the humanity of those situations. The more we use DNA technology for medical science in our everything's for sale society, the more we will see that technology abused, manipulated, and misused to the detriment of us all. Sold to the highest bidder. I know I sound all doom and gloom, but I'm a natural cynic, someone whose life has never gone according to plan, raised in an unstable atmosphere emotionally, physically, geographically, and otherwise. So maybe part of overthinking everything is me training myself to see the bigger picture first because I have to prepare myself for the worst case scenario. Maybe. Think of it like this. Who wants to be told they're normal, average, unimportant? You might have heard what I'm about to say as an idea or joke related to fortune tellers, but If a fortune teller told you you were nothing special, you had no gifts, talents, or higher connection to the spiritual realm, no remarkable future, would you ever go back to them? If you had your palm read and they just went, meh, looks like you're going to work for little to nothing your whole life and live too long so that you'll become a burden on everyone around you. You might dispute that credit card charge is all I'm saying. Today, while we could clone our pets and just have Buddy the Third or Snuffles Jr., the tech hasn't quite become that commercialized yet. It will be if it isn't already for the uber wealthy. Remember, they get to get bored with the thing before they'll let us have it. So by the time we have it, they've already had it for a while. What we do have today are the modern day inverse of crystal ball gazing, palm reading, tarot touting, aura aware, fortune telling, DNA testing. It's a way for us to explore the unknown of the past and fooling ourselves that we can use that to unlock or predict our future. At best, it makes us feel important in the present. Because after all, if 23andMe sent back the report that said, you aren't related to anyone special, you're just normal and very white, word of mouth would spread. Instead, go to TikTok or any social media and find any number of people glowing on and on about how they're related to royalty, celebrities, or serial killers. People are proud of weird things. More and more people buy 23andMe kits. More and more people are connected to more and more famous families, and more social media posts and videos are made, and more conversational drop-ins of, so I found out I'm 1.5% Dominican and Jewish. I had no idea I was Jewish, but my DNA shows I'm 2.3% Jewish. Oh, that's 3% almost. Technology, even medical science, especially in our current system, will make its way to the people to be commercially available and mainstream. Because corporations can do pretty much whatever they want. As long as you click that you've read and agree to the terms and conditions, and, well, it isn't until it's way too late before we realize we've sold our soul for the right to be at a social gathering and say we're somehow related to Abraham Lincoln. After all, none of these companies store our DNA, do they? They aren't selling our information on a cellular level, are they? They aren't selling us and our privacy out like our social media platforms, are they? Like our phones? How many times have you talked about something and then seen an ad for it? It's because you allow them to listen to your microphone and camera even when you aren't using it. Those many mini microphones and cameras on your phone, computer, watch, TV, home control, robots like vacuum cleaners, those Siri Alexa boxes, data from your debit and credit purchases, every single thing you've ever scanned. What? You didn't read the fine print? And we aren't reading the fine print here. What would be gained from a private corporation making you pay them to give them your DNA? Jesus, tap dancing Christ, didn't you think about that before you requested your testing kit? Well, I guess it isn't so bad. I mean, it isn't like some madman has tried to genetically assemble a master race of humans before, right? It isn't like the idea of genetic modification in pursuit of perfection or some twisted idea of ideal hasn't been attempted in the last 100 years or so, right? Now, I'm not saying that any of the DNA companies are aligned with that thinking or that the DNA tech movement is as a whole bullshit. I mean, built around a foundation of eugenics rather than genetics. But I am saying that in the wrong hands, this idea and fascination with DNA could devolve into misusing the ideas of eugenics, genetics, euthenics, and euthenics. That is what this episode is about. First off, let's set the definitive record straight when it comes to terminologies I'm going to discuss in this segment and beyond. Genetics, eugenics, eugenics, euthenics, and euthenics. Genetics is the science of genes. It's the study of DNA and hereditary traits and how those are passed down. Simple enough, right? Now, definitions of these words that all sound very similar but have very different meanings. Eugenics. The definition of eugenics is important to cover first, to better understand what it is we're really discussing. Eugenics is the science of improving a nation, politically and socially. Consider this sort of a fancy term for political science, which is a part of the social sciences. If you were searching Overthinking Everything in a library under the Dewey Decimal System, that's probably where you might find us on a bookshelf, so to speak. Eugenics. Eugenics is a scientific philosophy that has been widely dismissed and condemned mostly because of Nazi Germany and World War II. What was discovered of Hitler's quest for perfection shook the scientific community where the topic of eugenics is concerned. This is because it's the study of how to whittle out the undesirable characteristics, traits, diseases, etc. of a population through what is referred to as planned breeding, which is pretty much the same as preferential breeding, but different through the justification of some people, and that planned breeding has traditionally focused more on eliminating people you didn't want to breed, while preferential breeding is more like making sure your daughter marries a doctor if this was the 1950s. Technically different, but at the core, right, at the center, it's the same. And that's why this idea has been shut down. Because while some of it makes some sense, scientifically and practically, it treads on troublesome lines of elimination of people and groups. The slippery slope of, well, if we can prevent this, then why don't we? To seeing those people affected by this as lesser than, undesirable, and collateral damage to a greater good in the pursuit of perfection. Eugenics is the actual science behind the idea of eugenics. It's the study of improving humanity through gene editing. Copy and paste your chromosomes and markers or whatever, like a Word document. Eugenics is a science dedicated to improving the human race through its environment, specifically controlling the environment. Derived from the Greek euthenion, which translates to thrive or flourish. The study of eugenics is more about asking how can humanity be improved by improving the condition under which humanity exists. Do we thrive under pressure of minimum wages, debt, and threats of fascism? Or do we thrive more when everyone has enough to survive? Coined by chemist Ellen Swallow Richards in her book, The Cost of Shelter from 1905, this term is basically the argument that the film Trading Places makes. Sure, we might be primitively designed to make different choices when hard-pressed, but creating an environment where we don't have to make those choices would be optimal. A lot of Richard's work she's known for is for sanitary practices regarding industry, where she pretty much said, hey, drinking this nasty water is poisonous. Maybe we would all do better and live longer if we found a way to sanitize it first. You know, people eventually agreed. Except Flint, Michigan, apparently. A lot of places in America, actually. Because the science of eugenics is quite costly. It requires us looking at things we've always done a bit differently and then having to give some of that up. Some of what we know for the greater good. Mostly our privilege. Genetics, eugenics, euphenics, and euthenics. What do they all have to do with one another? In the context of what I'm discussing here, it's all genetic engineering, playing God one way or the other. In fact, progress really is like playing God. We decided we could get there faster with roads, so we dug up nature, displaced a bunch of critters, laid down chemicals, and bam, cars. The ideas of master racing to the top, race improvement, ethnic cleansing, these are ideas that simply cannot be filtered out when the idea of genetics comes into play. Notice I said genetics there and not eugenics. It's that slippery of a slope. Take a condition like diabetes. I'm type 2 diabetic. However, I'd like you to hear whatever you like instead of diabetes. Take something you have or someone close to you has and just plop that in instead. The idea that through genetics, I could identify the markers that could warn me I'm susceptible to diabetes, and that through eugenics, I can tweak my environment, eliminate sodas, snacks, candy, research what turns to sugar in our bodies, even if it's a natural food, and build a lifestyle of healthy diet and exercise. But if that didn't work, I could use eugenics to go in, have the geneticist tweak my DNA, and surprise, I'm not diabetic anymore. Or even if that science doesn't work that way, I could in utero have my unborn fetus's deoxyribonucleic acid refined to ensure she didn't get diabetes. What's the problem, right? The problem is when you go from type 2 diabetes to Down syndrome. And you're probably immediately thinking, why wouldn't we fix that if we could? You should be quickly thrust into a place of woke guilt by the fact that you just dehumanized someone. This isn't an abstract topic, this is a topic about people. People with type 2 diabetes, which is a hassle and should be eliminated, but also people with Down syndrome, where the thinking might go, if we could prevent more people from being born with it, shouldn't we? Turns into, but what about those who have it? What are we saying about them? That's the riddle modern medicine, humanity, hasn't been able to solve. How do you take the good without the bad to improve the facts of life? A step further. Let's say we agree that people with Down syndrome are as much people as people with type 2 diabetes. Duh. I mean, that's a given. No one short of a sociopath would suggest anything otherwise. And we agree that those living with both should be treated equally and like human beings. Again, a given. And some might agree that while people with both can live full, thriving, productive lives, the idea of being given a shot at life without those hurdles, challenges, or conditions is something we should at least consider, if we are, in fact, humane. Then, my friends, what are the boundaries? Where is the line? Moreover, and most importantly, who decides? Someone said, damn, diabetes is hard. Can't we check for that or fix it? Then someone said, did you know we could spot Down syndrome pretty early and scientifically alter the DNA to make that fetus not be born with Down syndrome? Then someone says, man, being short sucks. Can we do anything to make it so everyone is at least 5'8"? And someone says, try being over 6 feet tall. You can't fit into anything. And they all clapped together and agreed all humans forevermore should be 5'8" to 6'4". Except then the lesser than 6 feet began to get jealous of the superior in stature, and the superior in stature literally looked down on the lesser than 6 feet. Eventually, there's a breaking point. Then it's, shouldn't we all just be 6 feet tall? Call it even. No more, no less. Equality and equity. Everybody can reach the top shelf, and everybody's feet hang off the end of the mattress. What about baldness? What about hazel eyes? What about freckles, moles, shoe sizes, mental illness? When is it too much? Where does it stop? I know. Chicken Hardly Little here is telling you that the sky is falling, all because you wanted to feel special and swabbed your special cheek and found out, guess what? You're related to Rosie O'Donnell, whoop-de-doo. But it's a warning of what's possible. And I'm only forming that horrible assessment based on human history, the trends, evidence. Let's look where all this started. Scientifically speaking, the whole point of this episode is that this is human nature, the desire to spawn effective and superior offspring, and a fact of nature we must temper carefully. Sir Francis Galton first dreamed up the idea of eugenics in 1869. Incidentally, Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. His book, Hereditary Genius, lays out his research that suggests things like our personalities and our mental traits and abilities are all things that are as inherited as our physical traits. Yeah, not only do you have your Uncle Frank's nose, but also his sense of humor, alcoholism, and kink for butt stuff with fourth graders. Nobody wants to accept that. How did Galton come to these conclusions? Mostly through very flawed science, even for the mid-19th century. His research involved going over newspaper obituaries of prominent and affluent men in Europe, finding that their success was due to their superior genetics. Success was a dominant gene, poverty the recessive. Eugenics might have been a better scientific perspective here, at least maybe more pragmatic. The issue with Galton's approach is he came in with a bias of some sort. There was no cross-section or diversity. It seemed Galton wanted to prove the privilege riddle. How does one achieve that level of wealth and power? If you remember from high school science or English, your hypothesis or thesis statement is what you're out to prove. Wrong. If you go in trying to prove yourself right, human nature is to only see the evidence that does prove you right, and it'll dismiss anything that doesn't. We want to be right, even as scientists. So starting from an objective point of view and seeking to prove that wrong, that human nature of wanting to be right will work hard to prove that statement wrong. Galton clearly didn't do this. If you're only looking at very prominent, affluent, successful, powerful, influential people, where does the science look for the opposite? Ever heard of a control group? Then there's the gender bias of men, missing more than half of humans, then geographical, cultural, social bias by only looking in Europe. Finally, the fact that he was scouring through obituaries in the mid-19th century offers questions one might ask about today's obituaries. I didn't list that my dad was an abusive pervert with some very problematic views of the world in his obituary. I did that in my podcast. Someone not taking the whole of data into account might come to some skewered conclusions, you think? My dad's obituary was made to make my dad sound good. Reality wasn't all bad, but it sure as hell wasn't his obituary. What Galton did wasn't science, even in the 1800s. He basically wanted to say that rich white power players were better than everyone else because anything but that dismantles our socioeconomic and political structures. If those people are just those people because they were born into it, then who can hate them for being God's chosen? But then you realize the flip side of that is that those people are just those people because they were born into it. Not because they inherited the genes to be superior, but instead inherited the wealth, property, influential name, etc. And that makes people very uneasy because that's when privilege peeks its pesky head out so far people can't ignore it. Privilege and advantage. For a people who strive for equality, we sure can't seem to grasp the bare minimum on those concepts. Most won't even admit its existence because it threatens their comfort. It's easier to sit in your privilege when you ignore the plight of others. It isn't your problem after all. You weren't born into that shithole country, so why should you care? Besides, most every set of spiritual scripture being written to tell you why, it's easier for us to stuff our faces, keep our air on 65, drink our bottled water, and have a 44-ounce soda delivered to our front door. What's the difference? As a middle-aged white male, let me see if I can sort it out a bit. I've had advantages in life over others. It's who you know, right? I was born to a dad who might have been abusive, but he was also very affectionate. Maybe too affectionate to some people, maybe too physical without the affection for some. However, I wasn't born to an addict who ended up in prison with me in the foster system. Advantage over someone who didn't have a dad at all. Disadvantage, though, compared to someone whose dad had his shit together and wasn't into Amway. Privilege is more of a social hierarchy establishment of entitlement. There is advantage within privilege, but when someone speaks of white privilege, for example, that speaks to a larger social construct where the power establishment is reserved for white, straight Christian males who are considered people, and then everyone else is optional, subject to scrutiny, and can be best described by the "Please, sir, I'd like some more" scene from Oliver Twist, where the impoverished orphans are eating slop and the fat old white men who run the orphanage are all in their little special dining hall high above the sniveling street urchins, gorging themselves on a table full of food. The plate gets passed around the white folk first, then for seconds, then for anyone who wants to take some home to their dog, then thrown out into the trash, and the children severely punished for scouring through that trash for scraps. America. Now, one might think eventually if we're all genetically equal and there is no superiority, and the only superiority that does exist is seized on the suffering of others, then wouldn't we all begin to look at all those fat old white men and think, shouldn't we eliminate that from society? Maybe we can tweak our DNA to make sure our children aren't born greedy. Slippery slopes indeed. We're really hovering around two words that are fundamental to this exploration: good and bad, desirable and undesirable. The biggest question when discussing these topics is, and always has been, who makes those decisions? When we start talking about a perfect society or perfection personified, who is to say what is perfect? For the religious zealots, they might throw their hands up in the air and say, whatever their higher power made is correct. For the sane, we might argue something a little more scientifically unbiased. Even the God argument leads us down a path of, well, we evolved to this point with this technology, so maybe God wanted us to figure this out. Or maybe this is a test from God to see if we will abandon Him and assume the role of playing God ourselves. That train of thought is just maddening. So I insist we shelve that and focus on what is real. What's real is that everyone feels insecure about something. That insecurity is often tied to social factors. In early humans, strength and skill prevailed, but even most of those cared for the weaker and invalids. Invalid. Invalid. Fuck. Boy, we as humans sure don't think too highly of those less fortunate than us, do we? I mean, it seems as though early archaeological evidence suggests that humans might have been primitive, but they weren't savages. Rather quickly, it appears, early humans formed communities and social constructs, roles and rules by which to adhere. Then, as we got what one might call more civilized, more evolved, we began allowing corruption to seep through. The Judeo-Christian origin story of Adam and Eve, the creation of humankind, is a parable, a fable, by which we can all learn a lesson. Early humankind likely lived very differently than we do now, obviously. But when allowed to succumb to certain corruptions like greed, a physical monetary value is placed on certain things, eventually everything. That inevitably places a value on people, their lives, and their quality of life. That creates a hierarchy of superiority, eventually supremacy. The haves and the have-nots is not human nature, I'll argue. That is the savagery humankind has come to embrace. There are many literary examples of these types of warnings, from spiritual scripture to theatrical writings, poetry, historical accounts we've yet to learn enough from. The perfect man has been symbolized for centuries. The idea of perfection is nothing new. However, just like beauty, perfection is in the eye of the beholder. What is perfection? I've heard so many times in my life, there was only one perfect person, and that was Jesus. Yet even Jesus wouldn't swear to his own flawlessness. Even so, if Jesus Christ is perfect, then what does that say about non-brown Middle Eastern Jews? Slippery slopes indeed. This pursuit of perfection is rooted in insecurities. Look at Adolf Hitler. Physically, he was nothing like the master race he wished to create. In fact, if Hitler was just another German when another Hitler took charge, Hitler would have been Hitlered by that Hitler for being genetically the Hitler was. He wasn't of pure blood. However, that is defined by whatever sociopath defines it. Hitler was clearly bad for many reasons. One of the biggest was his take on eugenics. That he wanted to create a utopia formed of this master Aryan race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall, pasty-white, and handsomes is astonishing in and of itself. That he sought to achieve that by exterminating entire swaths of human beings simply because they didn't fit that mold. He sterilized people so they couldn't breed? We're barely scratching the surface of Hitler's atrocities, but what I'm about to argue in this segment is disturbing, triggering, and altogether hard to swallow. Hitler had a following in the United States. There have been Nazi rallies in this country, worldwide, since the formation of that ideology. Over 100 years, my friends, and it never died. Some might argue Nazi, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, Republican, but they're splitting hairs on a skinhead. This is a fact. His support wasn't exclusive to Nazi Germany. Look at the places he conquered. He conquered those lands with help from those who began to see things the way he did. His reach would have undoubtedly expanded even further had the U.S. not intervened. I'm not playing global savior here, just to say that we had a position in the world at that time, and standing back would have diminished that standing with the world powers and our place at the seat of the table of nations. We weren't heroes. We didn't intervene until it was convenient for us, not until it was unavoidable for us. You've probably heard that Hitler's playbook for human atrocities was written from our own Americanized version of savagery, our treatment of the indigenous peoples of this land and those we non-consensually emigrated to this land, to work this land. Hitler saw what the United States got away with and said, "Hold my Stein, watch this." But what about just the ideas? Not the actions so much. Let's talk about the sentiment in America during the early 20th century, especially among the powerful white elite, but also among even the serfs of that time. America First, created by Woodrow Wilson, a white supremacist and religious zealot, continued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a well-known racist, and as an actual political party throughout the first part of the 20th century, continues today through nationalist rhetoric, often laced with hints of racism, xenophobia, and other toxic ideals. We're number one! America first! The notion that America is the greatest nation in the world. How often have we heard ideas or words about America's supremacy on the global stage? It's almost like we are indoctrinated into this idea of supremacy at a very early age. America first. We are the chosen. How privileged of us. The chosen, even in religious terms, is offensive to the core of humanity. To suggest that any group is chosen by any god would then disqualify that god from being worthy of worship, don't you think? A god, as humankind has desperately tried to understand it, should be benevolent and unbiased. This god should not be concerned with colors, borders, or belief, but rather adherence to a higher order of being among other beings. By this understanding of God, hunting for sport might be an insult to their creations. Killing of any kind shouldn't be celebrated. In fact, the perfect person who would be pursuing that pragmatic piousness might abhor the taking of life on any level, if they honored their God and sought to be more like that God. That is not American society. Ours is a culture of killing and a fool's rationale of justification of that killing. Some people need a good killing, they say. When a mass shooter gets taken down by the cops, or in the rare case, a good guy with a gun, a vigilante, Americans celebrate. When our military blows the living smithereens out of a village, we cheer. Extra points if it's by drone strike. That certainly sounds like a flaw in the human system. That sounds like the polar opposite of the perfection spectrum. Makes sense why some people prefer to demonize entire groups of others based on race, gender, identity, nationality, etc. That's a much easier hate pill to swallow than pay very close attention to what I say, what I allow, and how I see the world and its peoples to determine whether or not I'm worthy of respect. Back to pre-Civil Rights Act America, the last gasp of white supremacy's domination. I know that sounds silly to suggest, but in a white supremacist-dominated system, we wouldn't have even the progress we've achieved thus far. That isn't to say our establishments aren't steeped in white supremacy. It's to say that white supremacy isn't necessarily the law of the land anymore. In a truly white supremacist system, we wouldn't have any accommodations for other groups, much less allowing those groups to, do anything. I know, easy for a white guy to say, hey, we have Telemundo and BET, so America isn't white supremacist anymore. But my point being that while we do have a lot of problems in the mid-20th century, America did try to cash in on all that all are created equal promise. Before that, this country's societal and cultural landscape was much different. Normalized violence, aggression, and bigotry ran rampant. Don't believe me? What exactly do you think a sundown town is? It's a town where if you weren't white, you'd get beaten to death if you were caught there after dark. No witnesses, no crime. If you were a woman after dark, you were probably going to get raped. But let's be honest, that was probably the norm in daylight in their own homes too, in these communities. Those sundown towns didn't magically cease to exist in 1964. However, after denormalizing white supremacy in America, more and more people grew to stand against the idea. More and more people began to speak out against those people who clung to that Confederate mentality. And today, more and more people are becoming aware of those biases, prejudices, and microaggressions that were normalized throughout most of my time on this planet. This is why that last gasp of white supremacy in 1964 has been a 6 decades-long sigh of frustration from those whose insecurities are so deeply rooted into their cultures, they know no other way of being than bigoted. Generation after generation spawned this Isaac and Ishmael split in American culture. Many in my culture, my toxic white Southern culture I fought so hard to escape, see wokeness as Hagar, and those who recognize it as the Ishmael, banned, banished off to the wastelands, exiled and ostracized by their families for being gay, falling in love with someone of another race or country, going to college, any number of reasons. While the Isaacs, those who stayed true to the ways of their parents and hometown, were granted all the inheritance, culturally, structurally, or individually. As in, within that culture, whistleblowers are thrown out. When you speak your truth about toxic church culture, you're no longer invited to holiday gatherings. You need Jesus and are filled with demons. When you comment on your cousin's pro-Trump post and call him out for being a fascist white supremacist who thinks Hitler had a good point, you're the problem and everyone unfollows you on Facebook. There is no unconditional love here, folks. You've seen it in your own families. And why? Because you aren't perfect. Never mind that neither are they. Never mind that most of these judgmental, hateful people are little Hitler-esque, undesirable oddballs who have no place to speak out against anyone. Undesirable. Hitler was, by many social accounts, undesirable. So why wouldn't he seek to eliminate those he seemed to deem as perfect? Level the playing field, so to speak. You know, if everybody's a troll, Hitler looks pretty good, maybe? Most don't think about it through that far, you know. In fact, perfect little blonde-haired, blue-eyed angel is so cliche, but also very indicative of a very Aryan attitude toward perfection. The desire for porcelain, unblemished skin? Yes, the entire cosmetics industry, too. What is beauty but the pursuit of perfection? From a perspective, of course. America's pursuit of perfection goes back to before the origin story of our nation. This nation was built on the ideas of creating a utopia where those disenfranchised Brits could escape and live the way they wanted, even farther away from the watchful eyes of the crown. The issue was that their utopia was already someone else's utopia. For them to have their utopia, they had to eliminate the original inhabitants. The idea of group supremacy is not an American issue. This isn't a European issue. This isn't a white issue. This is a humankind issue. In many other countries, cultures, the ideas of supremacy, be it racial, gender, religious, or social, it exists and always has. When we talk about white supremacy or any supremacy, we're essentially talking about insecurities so strongly held by a people so obsessed with their own inadequacies based on what they've been taught to believe is perfection. Better thans and lesser thans. America's better brother, lesser brother, back again. I make comments that I'm better than anyone who voted for Donald Trump because I was better than to vote for a fascist, racist, rapist, and smarter than to fall for a cult. What I mean when I say that is simple. I, Josh Brandon, despite all my flaws, am a better human being, a better person, a better everything than anyone who voted for Donald Trump. I'm better than them. They are lesser than me. That will always be the case, no matter what they or I do. It's a forever fact. It isn't one I need because I want to be above anyone or I need 75 million plus Americans to be beneath me. It's just simply a stated fact that just exists and just is. Who I voted for doesn't factor in. What I say or do never will matter. The fact is, my statement has nothing to do with me whatsoever, but is a complete condemnation to the compromise of compassion, common courtesy, ethics, morals, and the Constitution those people who voted for Donald Trump committed. The man wants to have sex with his own daughter. You tell me the kind of person who just shrugs that off. I'm better than each and every single one of those people. So are you, if you didn't vote for that guy. That is still a statement of supremacy. It's a fact of supremacy, but one based on the actions and behaviors of others, not for reasons that are beyond their control. I'm not better than them because they're uneducated. I'm better than them because I didn't do that thing they chose to do. And I'm not sure what I could do that would be worse than that as an American. Still, supremacy. I don't want it. I don't need it. I probably shouldn't even say it out loud, but none of that matters. It's supremacy. Based on an idea I hold about perfect patriotism. Granted, that idea is one unique to my own discoveries and not some dollar store cookie cutter version my dad told me, but I'm not sure that matters when sliding down the slippery slope of supremacy. Now, step back and examine this idea through the lens of our entertainment media, the way I've discussed it in previous episodes. Supremacy in sports, shows, music, #1 singles, hit sitcoms, New York Times bestsellers. One of these things is not like the other because it's simply the best. Better than all the rest. Be best. We're #1. Who's number 28? Who's last? The problem with this better than mentality is that the questions rarely asked are, who's last? And how can we help them get further up the list? Genetics, the science of genes and hereditary traits. Eugenics, how to improve society by eliminating undesirable traits or groups. Euphenics, the science of gene editing. Euthenics, how to improve a society through its environmental factors. Eugenics, political science, the social sciences. Social studies, often taught by coaches and long brushed aside as the least important of the core academic subjects in American classrooms. The truth is, eugenics embraces so many disciplines, it's impossible to ignore its importance. Like math covers basic arithmetic, algebra, calculus, trigonometry, statistics, and beyond. Like English language arts, poetry, prose, historical speeches, plays, short stories, novels, writing, and beyond. Like science covers geology, chemistry, biology, physics, and beyond. The social sciences cover so much more than history. Psychology and philosophy, mental health, morals, ethics, and values, civics, geography, government, the whole of political science. We are a political people. Politics, by definition, is critical to a society's survival. Adequate and appropriate representation of the people to make decisions for the greater good. Sharing ideas, compromise, negotiation. These are the gaping chasms in our education system as it stands. These ideals that should be taught in the home mentality creates an underserved youth, so that when confronted with those slippery slopes, they're ill-equipped with the logic and reasoning tools, those critical thinking skills to keep from falling prey to the ideas of supremacy. We all want to be #1, to be the best, without much concern for those who aren't. Look at the backlash over participation trophies. Those critical are diminishing the effort of even being there, trying, because they're so insecure and need to win that everyone getting acknowledged threatens their supremacy. If everyone is acknowledged for even trying, then fewer people are cheering for their big victory. Competition culture. This is a humankind problem, and more like human cruel. Eugenics is essential to evolving a society and should take a higher priority in the academic hierarchy. Genetics, science we cannot deny. But with the advancement of genetic science comes the need for some to prove they are better than other people, even in subtle ways we may not recognize as necessarily problematic. Back to the DNA testing kits to see who you're related to because we want to be special, right? We don't want to think we were always lowly poors. We want to think we're related somehow to greatness, to someone who is greater than the rest. We all desire that supremacy, don't we, in some ways? The ideas of planned breeding and preferential breeding are so similar, as I discussed earlier, that it crisscrosses our values in a knot where we're almost endorsing the atrocity one would think we would condemn with our dying breath. Planned breeding, which is more like what Hitler was about, is sort of treating people like livestock and breeding the best of the best, whittling out the traits that society deems undesirable, while encouraging the procreation of those society does value as humans. Tall with tall, fit with fit, beautiful with beautiful, it's often less consensual and borders on breeding racehorses and arranged marriages. Which genes will come out on top? Let's improve our odds. Preferential breeding is slightly different, even if the intent is the same. Yeah, that's right, I said it. We're indoctrinated into this clandom of our heritage and namesakes, reinforced by those DNA testing kits, herded into our pens of privilege. We want to be special, and we want to believe our DNA is special. We want to think we are special, and connecting to someone who once was special gives us hope that our lives aren't a total waste. So when our kid brings home a real loser and starts getting serious, we get worried. Not only does this dating below their league reflect on you as a parent, after all, if you were a good parent, your kid would have had the self-worth to not end up with a loser. But the idea that your grandkid, if God forbid that happened, would be half loser makes us cringe. So, we hope our kid ends up with a doctor or a lawyer. How often have you heard that? In some cultures, being a doctor is one of the highest social standings one can achieve. Here, it's all about the money. The person could be abusive, addicted to who knows what, gambling away every penny, or even a fascist. And who cares, so long as they're a doctor, right? Supremacy. The glorification of military and law enforcement mirrors this as well, but with more acknowledged sacrifices people make knowing before they even enlist or sign up. The idea on a much smaller scale is that this doctor's DNA will compensate for your limited DNA. That soldier's pension and strength, discipline, and other values will make for a strong family and stronger offspring. Plus, they'll likely have decent insurance. Let's be fair, though. We're more like breeding dogs than racehorses. We seem to take the most undesirable traits of dogs, the snotty pug nose, the tongue-wagging underbite, the stump-tailed, exposed asshole, loud-breathing, eye-draining, short, stout, stupid, and make that a trendy dog everybody wants for no reason they can particularly explain. Who decides desirability? There will never be an adequate solution for that, I'm afraid. Therefore, eugenics just isn't a consideration. Euphenics as well would be off the table. We're stuck with euthenics, and we've seen that humankind, at least America's brand, it just simply doesn't work. It's too expensive and requires way too much sacrifice. Because we can't rely on humankind to just be good, we have to look at gene editing science much differently and with much more scrutiny. In fact, in most places, it must be illegal, and is. Like artificial intelligence, gene editing seems a little too science fiction for us to grasp as a reality. However, the science is there. And we might argue, just as with any technology, the wealthiest of the wealthy already have acquired this type of privilege. However, this technology, the science behind it, and the philosophy that justifies it are all subject to misuse and manipulation. The problem humanity faces, the more we evolve, is that we get farther removed from the sins of our past. That perspective lost with each passing generation. The more we evolve, the more we will seek to utilize science to eradicate things like diabetes, cancer, and maybe even birth defects before they happen. Maybe we will create a utopia of healthy, happy humans. Maybe that will be what it takes to eradicate the generational traumas we've endured for centuries. After all, they say trauma can be stored in cells and passed to our offspring. Maybe one day eugenics can be used for the good of the greater good. We, Americans, all of humankind, aren't that evolved yet. Maybe before we attempt genetic editing or the betterment of society through planned breeding, we use the science of genetics for the greater good by turning to euthenics to build a world, a nation, a society, a community that is strong, trusting of our surroundings, our environment, and the world as we live it. To aid this evolution, as costly as those changes are and as uncomfortable as they make us, within a generation or two, the more intelligent species of human might be scoffing at the cavemen we once were, isolated in our dwellings, connected only by a small screen, necks hunched over, shoulders slumped, eyes strained, mental health exhausted, until the day someone stood up and said, "Technology is great, but we aren't using it responsibly." Maybe that will be a lesson in the future eugenics course. Humanity 101. Being better starts with you. When we change the environments that impact us negatively and we break that cycle of generational trauma, committing to changing the environment for future generations, we may just create a society of beings so in tune with their ethics and moral compass that when ideas of manipulating genetic science for the sake of creating a master race, that master race won't be of physical characteristics or geographical boundaries, but instead of healthy bodies, healthy minds, and creatures of compassion and kindness. After all, if we want to eradicate any undesirable traits, how about we look at those traits that lean toward exploitation of others, corruption of ethics, and the spitefulness we see all too often, especially on social media? Yes, slippery slopes indeed. Coming up in Feelings Over Facts, I'm exploring the 90s a little more and beyond, flashing back at some of the pivotal moments for the American working class since Reaganomics kicked in. We'll be taking a look at the influence of 24/7 infotainment media, the internet, and how that radicalized a generation. We've been discussing the deliberate dumbing down and numbing down of America, but what really contributed to where we're at today? In American presidential politics, the phenomenon that was H. Ross Perot. That feisty billionaire had something to say and the money to say it. How that movement, along with the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement, shifted the rhetoric of our society and thrust a chasmic division between factions of the American working class we may never repair. This will be a discussion on populist politics, but also how that's been manipulated, how we have been manipulated through faith, patriotism, privilege, and geographical luck of the draw. We've been violated at our very core values to devalue ourselves and diminish our place in society. We buy into these narratives about we, the working class, that are designed to keep us from fighting for our piece of the pie. Perot, like Bernie Sanders and other election-shifting outsider candidates, came along at the right time to speak some truth to power. Moving along the same line that my father, as troubling and problematic as he was, is more indicative of the rule to this culture we see today than the exception. My dad was a big fan of Ross Perot. My dad, the Southern Democrat, like many, latched on to Perot's message and rode that train. America, once upon a time, trusted its media and its government. This episode is about the degradation of that trust, how that happened, how that affected the American working class, and one step closer to answering, How the hell did we get to where we are today? We're looking at how so many Americans are encouraged to fight for their feelings while forgetting facts altogether, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, the Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook, is available on Amazon, and you can link to that through my website, joshbrandonmedia.com. Influence is also on Amazon, and it's for anyone on social media or who wants to be on social media and grow their brand. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music under Sir Talks a Lot, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work, all organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out some of my merch. I've got trigger tees and bumper stickers, more merch coming soon. That's all in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store, and you can find that on my website as well. Follow me everywhere you can find me. I'm on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and everywhere else. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Do all the things I need you to do and help me grow. We grow together. If you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.